to Music She Missed, the podcast where I get my best friend caught up in some of the most popular songs and artists that impact our lives. I'm Allison.
And I am Rachel, and who missed all the music.
Hi, Rachel. So this episode is a little bit different than our usual episodes because we're continuing last week's episode about the Beatles. So audience, if you did not hear last week,
definitely go back.
Definitely.
It's worth it.
So we're just going to jump right in.
Yes, we are. So last week I got to hear about an hour's worth on our Spotify account of music, and I got to hear the first half of the Beatles.
Right.
So Alison did an awesome job at kind of breaking it down into 2 different weeks with the Beatles. It was the Beatles as they were kind of the beginning years.
Yes.
Up to their touring. Correct?
Well, the last week's playlist goes through when they quit touring, which is up through the album Revolver.
Okay, and then this week your goal was from then to the end.
Right, and then when they break up.
Oh, I thought they broke. So they broke up? I thought it was because John Lennon died.
No, he actually didn't die until 1980. So the Beatles broke up at the end of the 60s, 1969, 1970.
So it was an actual break.
Oh, yes.
So I have a question for you. Since the Beatles are really special to you, what is a really fun, personal memory about the Beatles with you, your childhood, your life? Tell me.
That's a really difficult question because the Beatles have been such a big part of my life. I mean, my first, obvious answer would be seeing Paul McCartney in concert.
When was this?
6 different times over my adult life.
Serious?
Yeah. The first time that was the most special. I was 18 and I went with a good friend to Las Vegas and we saw him at the...
You've seen him 6 times?
Yes.
Wow.
The first time we had...
Las Vegas.
Yeah, we had really good seats and he just played all the songs I'd hoped that he would play and we were screaming and crying like little girls.
Like 18-year-olds do.
Yeah. But I have so many Beatles memories. And I'm sure we'll talk about more of them as the episode goes on.
Cool. Well, I'm excited that you love the Beatles so much.
So this episode is transitioning from the early Beatles to the late Beatles. And from here on, the Beatles no longer tour. So we're just doing studio recordings. Studio
stuff. Okay, so I'm not going to be hearing that one song on last week's playlist of all the girls just screaming out of just desire
right.
and passion for the Beatles. So tell me a little bit about why they stopped touring. Because if they're that popular, then why'd they stop?
Well, so a couple of reasons. One is they were on a really hectic schedule. In fact, a documentary just came out about it by Ron Howard. It's called 8 Days a Week, and it chronicles their touring time. And at the beginning, they really enjoyed it. They really liked it. They got to go to places they'd never been. But as Beatlemania increased, I mean, they were getting mobbed, basically, just hordes of girls chasing after them. They were moving from city to city so fast they didn't get a rest. And on top of that, they're recording 2 albums a year. And there was so much stress and strain. And later on in the 60s, it even became dangerous, after... President Kennedy was assassinated, right? So there's a lot there was some anti-Beatles sentiment as well, which we can also talk about later. But it was just, it stopped being fun for them. It stopped being enjoyable, stopped being safe. And so they called it quits. And for a long time, the Beatles kind of were silent. They had released Revolver, they'd stopped touring, and nobody had heard them for a while.
Even on recording
nothing.
Stuff. Wow.
And then they came out with the first album that will be on your playlist for this week. And so, which is Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And that album is the most celebrated Beatles album, and it shows a really strong shift in the direction of music and has influenced bands since then.
Really? Wow. Cool. So I need some advice.
Okay.
Before we get into the point of past Can I Recognize It stuff, can you tell me a little bit things that I should listen to this upcoming week?
Sure. So in comparison to last week, you mean? So you should listen for the introduction of a lot of new instruments and sounds.
Ooh.
You should listen for each Beatles individuality coming through. In the beginning, they're more of like a songwriting teams, especially John and Paul working together.
Okay.
Later on, each of the Beatles, including George is going to take more ownership of his songs.
And he's the drummer.
No, that's Ringo.
Okay.
George is the guitarist.
Guitarist.
So they're each going to be working on songs that are more their songs, not as a group.
Oh.
And it's okay if you don't know which Beatles doing which song, but just see if you can find like different tones or different sounds.
Okay.
I also want you to listen for a different song structure. They're going to move out of that simplicity that you saw last week.
Okay.
Verse, chorus, like simple pop. And so look for some unique song structures. And then finally, I want you to look for spirituality, because each of the Beatles have different spiritual histories, different takes, and they're going to bring that into their music. And you're going to hear that as well.
Cool. I look forward to it. So tell me about some of the musics that I'm going to be listening to this week.
Well, I happen to know that you already know one song, which is Hey Jude.
Oh, I do know that one.
And I had to put it on there just because it's probably one of their most recognizable songs. And if you don't know it, shame. So
I bet this was really hard to create these playlists for me.
I have worked harder on this particular playlist than I have on any other.
Really?
Yeah. Maybe harder than I've worked on anything in my life. It was so difficult for me because I think that...
You love me that much.
I do. And I want you to get the best picture of the Beatles. A lot of Beatles fans don't like the fact that the songs that most people know aren't really their best songs. And there's not room, I think, and there's not room to do all the songs everybody knows and all of my favorite songs. So it was really...
In an hour.
Yeah, no. It was really, really difficult. So I'm just going to throw some titles at you. Let me know if you've heard this before.
Okay.
All right? With a little help from my friends.
Yes.
Okay. You never watched The Wonder Years, huh?
Oh, is that song the theme song? That's them?
Yeah. Well, it's them somebody covering them, but yeah.
Really?
Mm-hmm. Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
I like that song.
So you know that?
I do know.
You said you don't like drug trippy stuff, and that's a trippy
That's a trippy one? I thought it was about I heard it was about a little girl that was coloring, that came over.
Well, it is, like, that's where he got the name, but listen to the rest of the song and then tell me if you don't think it's about...
That shows you how much I know about that song.
Penny Lane.
Oh.
Do you know that?
I didn't know that was the Beatles.
Yeah.
Wow.
But you've heard that song before?
I think so.
Okay. All You Need Is Love?
All You Need Is Love. I do know that's them, and I do like that song.
Oh, great. Okay, we'll do one more. How about... Oh, so many. How about Let It Be?
I do know that song. I like that song a lot.
Okay, so maybe you will like this half.
I think so. I like the first half, I mean.
Okay.
I like the first half. So I think I'm going to like the second one.
It'll be different.
But there was part of the first half that I didn't like that I'm wondering if it's going to seep into this half.
Well, you'll just have to wait and see.
We will.
Okay, Rachel. So our audience can check out this playlist by going to Spotify and following us at Spotify, /music she missed.
I can't wait to listen to the Beatles this week.
And audience, we'll be back with you in just a moment. Welcome back. Rachel, you spent the last week listening to the Beatles again.
Again. It was a good week.
Okay, well, let's talk about it. So before the break, I told you 4 things that I wanted you to look for when you were listening to the post-touring Beatles playlist.
Remind me those things.
Individuality in their music.
Okay.
More musical instruments. Spirituality. And more complex song structure.
Okay,
I wanted to know, first of all, if you found those 4 things to be true as you were listening to the playlist.
You know, I did.
Okay, good.
I found some songs that each kind of are really good examples for each of those things that you gave me.
Okay.
The intros to the new instruments, after listening to the entire playlist, I really sought after that. Mm-hmm. I think Here Comes the Sun is a good example that I liked.
Right, it has strings and
Yes.
woodwinds in it. Mm-hmm.
And I like that. It wasn't just straight guitar and drums and bass.
Okay.
I was really able to get to know John and Paul a little bit more with the song Day in the Life.
Talk about that song 'cause it's a pretty complex
Okay.
song. So when you're talking about getting to know John and Paul, it's because they each had these pieces of a song. John had his verses that basically came to him while he was reading the newspaper. The thing about the holes in Albert Hall.
Really?
Yeah, the man getting killed in a car crash. These were stories that he took from headlines in the newspaper.
Oh, so they weren't like, he wasn't in a car crash.
No, these are all things that he read. And then Paul had that little ditty in the middle about waking up and combing your hair and brushing your teeth or whatever, all of those little things in the middle. And so to conclude the Sgt. Pepper's album, they took these two pieces, each of their verses, and combined them, but combined them with that unusual orchestration that you hear where it's like da 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 da, and all of the orchestra is like increasing this huge explosion of slightly disharmonious sound. It's kind of an interesting creative process that showcases both of their different styles and their creativity, as well as has the instrument diversity that we're talking about.
I really got to know the Beatles' characteristics of a certain member was John in the song of Revolution. He really likes, I guess, rock and roll.
Yeah. I mean, all of the Beatles liked rock and roll, and both John and Paul had moments of tenderness and moments of rock. But John is typically known as more of the rocker, yeah.
The spirituality, I thought Let It Be was a great example.
I would agree with you. What particularly about that song was spiritual to you?
The history of life and history of the world.
Okay.
Trying to figure out the date that song really got big and seeing kind of what was going on in history.
Okay.
And just in the response of they wanted to encourage the audience to really spiritually respond to what was going on.
Right.
To just let it be.
Yeah, the late 1960s was a definitely tumultuous time. And the Beatles did have a lot to say about the atmosphere of society. I mean, here in the U.S., there was a lot of like racial tension, there's government tension, wars. I mean, Vietnam is going on. So there's a lot of things that they're kind of speaking to and encouraging love and encouraging, peace and understanding in different ways.
Yeah.
And Let It Be also, just for your knowledge, it has also the spiritual component, with talking about Mother Mary. Some people take a very Christian perspective on it, right? Whispering words of wisdom, let it be. But Paul's mother, who passed away when he was 16, her name was Mary. So it's a song that people can kind of take in the very literal, like Paul's writing it about his mom, or they can take it more like spiritually about like Mary, Mother of God, or they can take it like what you're talking about with a more like
response to history,
response to like
social events,
strife, and social events. I think it's multifaceted in that way.
The song structure one that you challenged me on to really kind of look at that. There were two songs that I looked at, and it was The End.
Okay.
And again, I kind of want to answer this with the same song, A Day in a Life.
Okay.
Of understanding how the song structure from part 1 to part 2, those two songs just kind of stuck out to me.
Well, that definitely makes sense. The End is the almost last track that is on a Beatles album, and it's kind of unusual. It's at the end of a medley, and unfortunately in your playlist we don't get to hear the whole medley. Okay. But it ends with this kind of weird kind of solo progression. We hear Ringo's first drum solo ever.
Okay, so it keeps continuing on.
And it continues on with each of the 3 guitar playing Beatles soloing in kind of like 2-measure.
They each get their turns.
But they take turns over and over and over again, and you get to showcase each
They're Beatles. Like doing a ring around.
Yeah, and it's one of the only times that you get to hear all 4 Beatles soloed together in one song, and it's not the last song, but it's kind of like the last song. So it's an interesting summation. I wouldn't say it's like the most famous Beatles song or anything, but I put it on the playlist because of what that represented. And when Paul plays live, he often sings the little catch line from that song, and in the end, the love you take is equal to the love you make. He sings
That's really
that
cool.
song at the end of his concert, because that kind of sums up, what the Beatles are about.
And I know within this podcast, we usually don't do the same band with 2 weeks. And so
we probably never will again.
But that's one of the things I really liked about these past 2 weeks, where you could take last week and challenge me to really listen to something and learn about that specific band. And so I really appreciate that this week.
Well, I will try to include more challenges in the future for you to listen to, because I know what's coming up, even if you don't. So we don't have to do the same band 2 weeks in a row for me to challenge you to listen for certain elements and songs.
Very cool. Very cool. Well, so I want to talk a little bit about my likes and dislikes.
Great. Which one do you want to start with? I would prefer we start with dislikes so that we can end on a positive note.
Ooh. I tried to like these songs, but
you didn't.
Just didn't.
All right, let's talk about them.
Sgt. Pepper's song.
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band.
Yes, so let me ask the questions and tell you a little bit why I disliked it.
Okay.
And then you can go into helping me maybe like it. You never know.
I can try.
So I didn't like the sound. I didn't like that concert sound of him speaking out to the audience. I know that where some of these other songs are maybe about certain people in his life or things like that. But this one, I just didn't like how he was speaking to the audience. Sound of the scream. I know that was that concert feel. And then I didn't like the lyrics of certain things that just confused me.
Can you give me an example?
Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts, and he wants to give someone a smile. How can you give someone a smile when you have a lonely heart? Like, the logic of that, I was just trying to grasp, and I'm like, these lyrics do not have that logic.
Right. Okay, well, let's hit each of those things that you said.
Oh, I have one other thing.
Oh, another thing you don't like about the song. I'll do my best.
Sergeant. Where did he get his ranking? Was he in the military?
You're reading way too much into this title. So in the mid 60s at this time, a lot of bands had moved away from like the Beatles, the Crickets, right? And had moved into Colonel Sassafras's fancy magical psychedelic freak band, right? Like all the bands all of a sudden became...
There's another band that says Colonel what?
No. I'm just making stuff up.
Oh, okay. Well, I don't know.
But there were a lot of these kind of long, fantastic, trippy, psychedelic sounding band names. And this is Paul just kind of making up a fictitious band name that sounds like some of these other bands.
So this is his response to what's happening socially.
Correct. And at the time, we talked about last week how the Beatles had stopped touring. And the singles that they released in between that, the end of the touring and this album, did not go to number one. It was the first ones to not do that, which were Strawberry Fields Forever and Penny Lane, A and B side. And so people were kind of like, oh, the Beatles are over, blah, blah, blah. And so Paul wanted to kind of, they wanted to take a step back from being the Beatles. And they created this concept album, Paul really spearheading this, and saying, well, we won't really be the Beatles in this album. We'll be this fantastic Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. And that's why this first song is presented like it's them opening a concert. And it moves into, with a little help from my friends, Billy Shears, which is really Ringo, singing that song. They're kind of saying, they're separating themselves from the Beatles and they're creating this other world. And later on in the album, which you don't hear on our playlist, is there's a Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band reprise where they sing it again, but they do it in a different style, and they say, we really have to go and we're sorry, but here's one last song before we go. And then it goes into A Day in the Life. So it's a conceptual...
So the Beatles are pretty much saying, oh, let's get into different character.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, kind of distancing themselves from their mop-top days, from their, here's what you expect from us, and doing something totally different.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting.
I don't know if that answers if that makes you like the song, but it at least should explain
It kind of explains a little bit why they just didn't sound like the Beatles.
Yeah,
because their goal was not to sound like the Beatles.
And every song on this album, I would encourage you to listen to the album in chronological order as it was originally created, because it is a concept like that.
Okay.
And it is a huge departure from the music of the past and really sets a new standard for what the Beatles were going to be like in the future.
Okay, so I can understand why this was in part 2 and things like that, and there's that split.
Yes.
Cool. You didn't answer the question about his ranking. It's just silly.
Made up. It's just silly.
It's just silly. Okay, I didn't know if one of the 4 guys went into the military at that point.
No,
it wasn't like Elvis Presley, because didn't
No.
he? Okay, because didn't he go to the military? Okay,
You're correct.
yay.
But no, that's not that. This is just a made up hippie name.
Okay, just for fun.
Yep.
So Strawberry Fields was another one that I didn't like.
Okay. Let's talk about why.
What in the world? The lyrics, just like, I was like, where am I? It's weird. I found out that this half of the Beatles, I was more confused. And this was on the top list of, I am confused. What is going on? Please enlighten me, because I was so confused in this song, it made me dislike it.
Well, that's too bad. So, first of all, let's just clarify that John wrote this song.
Okay.
And that this was one of his favorite songs that he ever wrote. And to him was one of the, quote, realest, like the most real songs that he ever wrote. It was very personal to him. So we'll talk a little bit about the history and the background of that song. So Strawberry Fields was the name of a children's home that was in John's neighborhood. And surrounding the home, behind a wall, was like a big garden. Mm-hmm. And when they were boys, they would go and like play in this.
That was the field that they played in.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
But it wasn't just a field. I mean, it was like trees and flowers and plants. And it was kind of like a little boy jungle, where they could go play and explore. So this song is for him a piece of nostalgia. In fact, both Strawberry Fields and Penny Lane as A and B sides are them being nostalgic about their past.
Okay.
But you can see very different takes between John and Paul stylistically there. John said it was psychoanalysis set to music. So looking back on it in later interviews, he said that, quote, "What I'm saying in my insecure way is nobody seems to understand where I'm coming from, and I seem to see things in a different way from most people." So he's kind of like evaluating himself, and then how he's always been a little bit different, even as a kid. He was just different, and people would question, why do you say that? Why do you think that? And so this song is him kind of analyzing himself. So no one, I think, is in my tree, right? Meaning it must be high or low. People are on different levels. Is anybody on the same level as him? Do they understand what he's trying to say?
That was one of the things that I just noticed within the lyrics of the second half is, why did the Beatles artists just not say it as it is? They're like,
Well, what would you prefer the song to be?
More direct.
But what would you want him to say? I mean,
I don't know. That's a good point. Like, I don't know exactly what I would want him to say either, but I just felt a little I felt confused out of these 2 songs, specifically Strawberry Fields. And so now that I know it's a little bit about his childhood,
and also
I like that.
Self-discovery. And the process of self-discovery and introspection, I don't think is very direct. I think it's difficult. And I think maybe in writing this song, John is exploring those ideas himself. What does it mean? He says, it's getting hard to be someone, but it all works out. Right? And there's misunderstanding, and we often have our eyes closed. What is life about? What is the human experience about? Right? How do we approach problems? How do we approach different experiences? Nothing is real, right? So he's kind of evaluating his through the lens of childhood
and through his life and how he interpreted it.
Yeah.
Interesting. Very interesting. Well, I want to talk a little bit about what I liked about this playlist.
Yes, let's do that.
So, with a little help from my friends.
You did like that one?
I did like that one. I thought that one was really cute, and I didn't know that it was that's the song from the Wonder Years. I just never knew that was the Beatles.
Yep.
Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds.
Which is interesting that you say that you like that, even though it's trippy. After you listened to it 7 times, did you still like it?
I did.
Okay.
Yeah, I liked it.
Cool. I like that song too. I think
Mikey likes it. Rachel likes it.
I think it's a really fun song.
I liked Hey Jude. Here Comes the Sun. I thought that was just very peppy and happy, encouraging, and that's very me.
That's a lovely song by George Harrison, I should mention.
Oh.
So that's, I think, one of his best pieces, and I agree, it is very pretty. And that's on the Abbey Road album.
Come Together. Part of it I liked.
Which part? Like the chorus, Come Together?
Yeah, I like the
now?
chorus part, Come Together, and the lyrics. But there are some ways of how they delivered the lyrics towards the end I wasn't the biggest fan of.
Was a little too yelly for you.
Yes.
How did I know?
How did you know?
Okay.
All You Need Is Love. I think that was a cute song. And Let It Be. Revolution. That was another song. I didn't know that was the Beatles. Like, I've heard that song, like, maybe in a movie or something like that. And I just never knew that was the Beatles. And Blackbird
That's one of my personal favorites.
Is actually the one on my like list. And it was one of the first, that song I've never, ever heard before.
I find that impossible to believe, especially because you lived with me, and that's like my favorite song to play on the guitar.
But again, I will go into restaurants and never hear any songs when I know that there's music on the PA. I just don't hear them. Or I go into a store and I know there's music on a PA, but I just don't listen to the music.
Okay.
But
you liked it.
Yes, I did. Yeah. I liked it. I'm kind of curious, and maybe you can answer this question. Out of the songs that I liked, and how you told me a little bit about part 2 has more, this is a John song, this is a Paul song. Out of all the songs that I liked, how many are they John songs, Ringo songs?
You actually, well, okay, so Ringo sings songs, but he only wrote like 2, so.
Oh, did any of those 2... Were they?
Well, no, he didn't write either of those. Oh. Ringo songs are not very good in my opinion. So I left them off. You actually kind of split it down the middle. Really? Now George didn't get as many songs per album, and we can talk about that with the breakup. But
that's my next question. Yeah. I was curious. I never knew that they broke up.
Yeah, but no, you have John and Paul on there, so.
So I like John and Paul.
Well. You like the Beatles then, because John and Paul pretty much are the Beatles. Oh. Yeah, with some George and then like a little bit of Ringo. Yeah.
Cool.
So.
Well, I'm glad I like the Beatles then, because I know you like the Beatles, and I'm glad we can agree.
And I love the Beatles so much, but we have to talk about the saddest part.
Okay.
Which is the end of the Beatles.
The end of the Beatles. Yes, please tell me more.
Well, what do you want to know?
So, was it a surprise to the audience? Was it a surprise to them? Was it sad for them? Angry for them?
Good questions. So the Beatles breakup is pretty complex.
Okay.
And I don't want to go too much into detail. But basically after they stopped touring, things start kind of unraveling.
That's when they did part 2 of all those songs.
Yeah, everything that we've heard in this playlist is the beginning of the end. In 1966, their manager, Brian Epstein, died.
Oh. How did he die?
An overdose.
Oh, sad.
So there became a question of, okay, well, what are they about then? They're not touring. And Paul was really the one who loved touring and loved performing the most. So who's going to lead the band, right? Who's going to lead the direction? And,
so they were going to get a new manager, maybe?
Well, but they didn't. It's more complicated. It's kind of Paul saying, well, let's do these projects. Paul says, let's do Sgt. Pepper's, where we're not really the Beatles. And then they went to India, and they kind of did this spiritual exploration thing. Paul and Ringo weren't really into it. George was really into it.
How long did that India thing happen?
It was a few months.
Oh, okay. So it wasn't like a few years.
No.
Oh.
Also, they set up a business called Apple. That had like money problems.
You mean Mac?
No.
Apple Mac?
No.
Oh, so not my iPhone.
No. In fact, like the reason that the Beatles weren't on iTunes for years and years is because they had the same name. And when Apple computers came out, the Beatles Apple were like, hey, you can't do that. We already have a company called Apple. And so they were like, well, we can both be Apple as long as we don't get into each other's business. And so then when Apple computers starts dealing with music, right, because of iTunes and music publishing, the Beatles were like, well, then we won't put our songs in iTunes. They finally resolved that problem, so you can now listen to the Beatles on iTunes, but it took a long time.
So their first Apple company was about music.
It was music, it was clothes, it was music publishing. They were finding new artists to produce songs for.
Oh, so they're a production company.
Yeah, kind of. They were kind of a mix of things, and that was part of the problem, is that there wasn't a clear
definition
of it. Okay. Exactly. Another big issue was romantic relationships, the most famous of which is Yoko Ono.
Oh, yeah. And she dated
John.
Yeah,
she married John.
Oh.
And when John and Yoko got together, they were inseparable, like literally would go to the bathroom together. They were never, ever apart. And Paul especially got kind of fed up with, because Yoko sings on, like you can hear it on the White Album, you can hear Yoko sing a couple times. She would put in input into musical creation, and she was an artist herself.
How did they meet?
They met at her art gallery. She had a show, and John went to go check it out. And the very first exhibit, there was a little step ladder, and hanging from the ceiling was a magnifying glass. And so to go to the exhibit, you had to like climb up the step ladder and look at the tiny words on the ceiling. And John's thought was, well, let's see what this is. If it's something good, then I'll see the rest of the show. And he looked at it, and it just said yes. And he thought, oh, that's positive, that's nice. And so he went to the rest of the show and met Yoko that way.
Oh. And so she monopolized John.
Yeah, I mean, they were so in love, and they were just inseparable.
Was she controlling?
I don't want to speak into their personal relationship in that way.
Do some people think she was controlling?
Some people are not Yoko Ono fans. I don't blame her for the breakup of the Beatles. I feel like she's just one piece. There were lots of bad feelings, especially from George and Ringo, feeling unappreciated. George, in the beginning, Paul and John were the main songwriters, and George would get like a song now and then. But as the years went by, George became a more and more prolific songwriter, but he was still only getting 1 or 2 songs on an album. And he felt at that point his songs were just as good as John and Paul's, and he wasn't really getting...
And without a manager at that point to kind of...
I mean, they had a producer, George Martin, but Beatles were always...
conflicting.
Well, self-contained. They didn't have a lot of outside direction.
Okay. And
so, in the end, there were a lot of money problems, a lot of legal problems. And the other 3 Beatles, like one lawyer...
Were they making too much money?
No, Apple started to go bankrupt.
Oh.
Because of mismanagement.
Okay.
And the other 3 Beatles wanted one guy to represent them, and Paul wanted someone else, and Paul wouldn't sign this agreement, and so...
He signed without permission, I guess, with everyone else agreement.
Yeah, he was kind of on the opposite side. So all of these things, eventually, Paul was the one that came out and said, like, we're over.
So it wasn't a surprise to the audience? Or did they hide all this issues?
I think a lot of it was in the background.
Okay.
And Abbey Road, which was the last album that they recorded together, was a really fantastic album. And I think it probably, I mean, we weren't alive back then. I don't know, but I would suspect that it caught most fans off guard. I don't think it caught off guard anybody who knew them. I think the people on the inside, the Beatles circle, would have seen it coming, could see the conflict in all the different areas of their lives. But I don't think most of the fans probably saw it coming until Paul announced it.
Huh. So if they kind of knew that it was going to happen, are they friends now or not really?
Well, you know, the reason that Abbey Road is good is because they kind of knew it was the last one, so they really put effort into it.
Oh, okay. So before they started, they were like, hey, let's just do one last one.
They never said it, but I think it was all just in their heads. They all kind of knew. So unfortunately, no, they were not friends for a while. Especially John and Paul. They actually wrote mean songs about each other that they released. Not terrible. Well, John's were pretty mean. Paul's were more just like snide. But
wow, they did so much stuff together.
Yeah, it was like a bad divorce, basically. Ringo and John were cool. They did some stuff together. And then John, there was like talk of reunion, and there was like talk of reconciliation, and then John was killed. And so...
How was, like, explain to me a little bit. He was shot, right?
Yeah, he was just going home with Yoko, and a crazy person came up and shot him in the head.
Oh. Was she standing right there with him?
Yeah.
Oh, so it was like a whole JFK, Jackie sitting right next to him.
I mean, it was terrible.
That's sad.
Yeah. So that obviously put the end to any reunion. In the 90s, the Threedles, right? The other Threedles.
Oh, okay,
yeah.
okay.
In the 90s, the Threedles got together. They produced the Beatles anthology. which is the history of all the Beatles and recordings that fans had never heard before. And they also took, with Yoko's permission and help.
So she inherited everything.
She inherited John's stuff.
Yeah.
And so they took some songs that John had written, and they took that recording, and Paul added vocals and George added guitar and Ringo. So they made 2 more Beatles songs after John's death.
Really?
With a recording of John's voice and then them recording kind of in it with new technology. So there were 2 more Beatles songs, but then George passed away in 2001, I believe, of cancer.
Oh.
And so now we're just at the Toodles.
The Toodles.
Yeah. But Ringo and Paul are buds now. Yeah.
They've moved on.
Yeah.
How old are they now?
They're in their 70s.
Okay, so then they're not young guns anymore.
No, but both Ringo and Paul still record music and still tour. And
do they tour together?
Paul especially, they have done a few things together, but not too much. Paul collaborates with a lot of other artists. He's collaborated with Kanye and Rihanna. He's collaborated with the remaining members of Nirvana, right?
Yeah.
So they're still active.
Would you say Paul's more popular than Ringo now?
Paul is a songwriting genius. He's continued to put out albums over the past 40 years or whatever.
How many albums does he have now?
I don't even know.
Wow.
I mean, I'd have to look it up and count. And Ringo has recorded some things too, but I mean, Ringo was the drummer. And he, he has some songs and stuff, but he's not a great singer. I mean, you can still go see him live and you can hear a couple of his songs that were hits or whatever. Ringo did movies and stuff. But I mean, Paul is a songwriting genius. So, I mean, to compare them is...
Do they live in the UK still?
Mm-hmm.
In London?
I don't know.
Okay, I didn't know. I know you've been to London, so. So, I really like this half. This was fun.
I'm glad that you did.
I can see where it was super hard to pick some of the songs.
Yeah, I wish I could make a totally different Hour One playlist for you of totally different songs.
But I also see the logic of which songs you picked, and then also how you split the songs into part A and part B.
Oh, I'm glad.
So my hat is off to you.
Good, well, thanks.
My hat is off to you.
So how would you rate this half of the Beatles? On a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being the trash, 10 being...
I still like the Beatles, so I do like the Beatles, and so it's not like I dislike them. And I think if I'm remembering right, I gave them an 8 on the first half.
That is correct.
For the second half, I don't think I can give them an 8.
Well, that's okay.
I think I can give them a 7.
Okay, well, that's not...
It's not like a 4 or something like that.
Yeah, so overall, you give the Beatles a 7.5, which I think is a very good rating.
It is a positive rating. I do like them. I think they are geniuses. I will conclude that. I have acknowledged
you and the rest of the world.
Well, the thing is,
us.
I've really never gotten into them. I really have never really taken the time to listen or learn about them, let alone learn there was only 4 guys and what their names were and that kind of stuff.
That's really...
And I like some of the lyrics, and I think they're really sweet.
If you, our audience, would like to join Rachel on her musical journey, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter.
And also leave us a review on iTunes. Also, listen with me on Spotify.
Yes.
You can find us by the search bar. You're going to type in Spotify : user : music she missed. Make sure you don't put any spaces in music she missed, so you don't miss our Spotify playlists.
All right. Rachel, thank you so much for giving my favorite band 2 weeks of your time. And audience, thank you for listening.
Thanks so much, and see you next week.
See you next week. Bye.
Bye.